that today we're focusing on nurturing resilience in ourselves and others. I think this is a particularly important subject right now, given everything that we are going through. But actually, resilience is a really interesting topic that has gained more and more interest, especially in the education field, I think. And so when we ask about why is it that people are interested in resilience, it's really simple. It's because the research, and there is lots of research in this area now, indicates that an individual's level of resilience really has an amazing impact on their well-being, their engagement with work and study, and their general mental health. And so it's definitely something that it's worth us investing time in understanding better. We know that, for example, resilient people just seem to experience low levels of depression and anxiety. They generally enjoy better mental health, and if a problem occurs, because it's life and problems do occur, we respond often to a situation that life presents us, and where it does happen, what we find is that people have problems less often, and if they do, they experience it in a way that's less severe. We also know, and for those of you who perhaps joined me for the previous talk that I did, and I talked a lot about oxidative stress, where actually people, we talked about the relationship between mental health and physical health. And we know that people who are resilient also seem to experience better physical health. And again, when they have problems, as we all do, they tend to happen less often and to be less severe. And that if we support the development of resilience early on, which is one of the things I'm really interested in, the effect appears to be lifelong. So it's clearly an area that's really worthwhile thinking about. So in children and young people, we know that resilient children have generally higher levels of educational engagement and educational attainment, because it's difficult to attain educationally unless you're fully engaged in education. And in adults, we know that resilience is associated with higher levels of positive emotions and a perception of just generally better coping with the challenges that life throws us. And actually, regardless of the job, we have higher levels of job satisfaction and engagement. So I hope I persuaded you. It's definitely worth knowing about. So what is it? If we had more time, we'd have a discussion now about what your perception of resilience is. But it'd be interesting to see how it marries with the sorts of ways that we think about it in psychology. So it used to be described, and is often described still by lots of people, as the capacity to bounce back and to recover in the face of challenge and stressful situations. Interestingly, in psychology these days, we kind of tend to think of it slightly differently now. So we think of it as a sort of process that drives a person to actually utilize adversity and disruption in their lives to actually better support them deal with future adversity and disruption. And so it's not just a question of bouncing back to where you were. Actually, fundamentally, it's bouncing back to where you were, but with a greater set of strategies in your toolbox for how to deal with the same problem in the future. Because bouncing back to where you were sort of doesn't take account of the process of learning from that experience. So now we think of it as actually a process where people can fundamentally learn from the experience they've had and deal with future challenges in a way that's better for them. So we look at it in this is a really typical psychology. This is a typical definition of a concept in psychology. So we talk about resilience as being a pattern of positive adaptation and development that's manifested in the context of adverse experiences. So what we mean by this is that it's a pattern of behavior. So it's not a one-off thing. It's actually not a single quality. It's a pattern of response that means that you respond to adversity in a particular way. And the particular way is a positive one. It's one that allows us that has benefits for the individual. Our capacity to adapt is one of the fundamental really strong aspects of humanity. We adapt. We really are very good at adapting. And what we're saying here is that you have a pattern of response that allows you to respond to have a better to respond positively to a challenge. And it's called adaptation because it underlies the fact that you adapt as a whole human being. So you have thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that can change and evolve and learn from what you're experiencing. So to begin with, in resilience, a few decades ago, was seen as fixed. You were either born resilient or you were not, which wasn't very optimistic for the rest of us, I think. But then we sort of thought, well, what is it that would be really beneficial to understand? We saw people trying to isolate what was it about some individuals that really seemed to indicate that they would still flourish even in very, very difficult circumstances. And I particularly like this piece of research because it shows very clearly the sorts of outcomes and the sorts of experiences and the way that they kind of work together. So in life, we have levels of adversity, and people either have low adversity or high adversity. They have a relatively trouble-free life, or they have a highly troubled life, or the experiences they have cause them trouble and challenge. And then the outcome that you have in terms of your health and your physical and mental health is either a positive one or a negative one. So it's hardly surprising potentially that if you have a life that's relatively low in adversity, that you should actually have a positive outcome, which is what these A people are about. It's also not entirely unsurprising to say that if you have a life that's high in adversity, that you potentially have a negative outcome. You experience greater difficulties with your physical and mental health. You're more vulnerable. And that's what these D people are about. And then there's this other group where people who have low adversity and yet nonetheless have an unexpected negative outcome. And those people we deal with separately. These people will clearly would need some support. But for resilience, what we're really interested in is the fact that you have people who have high levels of adversity in their life and yet unexpectedly have a really positive outcome. They enjoy good mental and physical health. And so these were the people whose characteristics researchers were really interested in finding out what was going on. And so going away from a position of thinking about, well, you're either born with it or you weren't, what actually is we've moved towards is understanding the relationship between personal characteristics and environmental factors. And what we now understand is that actually being resilient is partly about the individual and the characteristics they possess, and partly about the experiences that they have. And this is a really good place to be, because otherwise there's a situation in which you kind of say, if somebody isn't resilient, you almost kind of blame them for not being resilient. And what we now know is actually it's a much more complex situation. So you take an individual and you place them in a situation that has a whole range of levels of influence: family, school, community, society, the circumstances into which they were born, and there are different ways in which those things interact to produce a resilient individual. And so the way to think of it is to sort of think that life is a sort of balance between negative experiences and positive support. And so what we look is for a situation where life is going to throw difficult things at you, but if you have positive support, then you have a positive outcome. What I guess I hope that we'll do as a consequence of things like our better understanding of resilience is that what we do is we have a situation in which we support, if you think it's like a fulcrum, that we kind of support you to become more resilient so that actually you can deal with greater levels of adversity and still have a positive outcome. So what are the characteristics of resilient people? So resilient people are normally blessed with a positive self-regard, so good self-worth and high levels of optimism. And we'll come back to optimism in a second. People who are resilient tend to be able to express their feelings. They have something called low levels of reactivity. So low levels of reactivity basically is it sort of means that you don't respond to situations very, very quickly on the hoof. So you are more measured in your response. So people have good emotional and impulse control. So that's not a about not feeling emotions at all. I think good emotional control is often seen as sort of controlling your emotions. That's not what we mean. Good emotional control means is that you respond to life. It's just that you respond to it in a measured way, and if you do respond in a big way, that you're able to control your emotions back again. So people who are resilient tend to have good coping strategies, and again, good impulse control and a realistic assessment of their own capabilities. So people know what they're good at and they value what they're good at. And that impulse control is now twice. You can see that it's important. So people who are resilient tend to have good social skills. Making friends and keeping them is a really interesting one. And again, if we had more time, we could do a lot about that. The skills that it takes to make friends are not the skills that it takes to keep them. These are very different human skills. And the thing about being resilient is that you learn the difference between the two and you actually are able to possess both. Another characteristic is a sense of belonging to family, to community, to whichever group provides you with support. And social support is really important. The trust aspect is an interesting one too. So it's about the capacity to trust people. And that doesn't mean to say to kind of trust in a sort of naive way. It's about expecting to be able to trust people and also knowing that you yourself are trustworthy and they are trustworthy and so are you, and you merit their trust. So people who are resilient are more engaged with learning, and the key thing is, and it's particularly visible in children, is that they're not only motivated to learn, but because they're motivated to try things because they're not afraid of failing. And I think the fear of failure is often what stops certainly many children and possibly many of us from actually not doing some of the things that we want to. And then this capacity to plan, to reflect on the experience that you've had and to make choices is a really important one. So can resilience be learned? Well, I mean, yes, because otherwise this evening would be very unhappy, I think. But we need to think about it. And that sort of means about supporting ourselves and supporting other people. And if you are a parent, it's also supporting how you plan you might support your children. So the characteristics that I've just talked about are actually quite complex. But the key to it is to remember that it's not one thing. And you can do lots of different things that actually ultimately lead to the same conclusion. So having done more reading about this than I care to think about, my fundamentals that I wanted to share with you with this. Good emotional regulation. The students that I work with, all of them work with children and young people, and I've said to them often on many occasions, helping children to develop good emotional regulation, not to jump off the deep end, to not overreact to a situation, is one of the fundamental things that we can really help them with. Good impulse control. Impulse is a normal part of human being. It's what makes us to develop the way that we have. But it's also knowing how to control that impulse if that impulse is not going to be to your good. The ability to analyze and solve problems. So the ability to analyze and solve are two slightly different things, but it's difficult to solve without analyzing. So it's helping children especially to deal with that. Realistic optimism. So it's not about kind of being really Pollyannish, but it's actually about finding optimism in everything. Looking on the positive side of things. Empathy for others, the capacity to feel and to kind of know that you belong to a group and that we have a shared experience and a shared responsibility for each other. And then a sense of competence and capability. And it's really interesting how lovely it is to feel capable of doing something, whatever that is, whether it's baking or whatever it happens to be. That sense of having done something really well is an amazing feeling that is absolutely part of being resilient. And out of all of this, there is the outcome, which is significant improvements in self-esteem. So if we're going to help other people to develop resilience, and actually, in a sense, to help ourselves, it's about thinking about the way that we take care of ourselves. So being resilient actually means also taking care of yourself and modeling resilient behavior. again, something that I say to my students often, because I have learnt this very much in all the research I've ever done, is that children and young people look to you, to us as adults, all the time. And indeed, we look to other people's behaviour all the time. It's no good saying do this when you do something entirely different. So it's about modelling resilience behaviour. And that means the way we speak with them, our expectations of other people, our expectations of ours, the expectation of ourselves, and actually, in a sense, children and young people's expectations of themselves, and the way that we model and support and teach them about the way we engage with the world. It's very difficult to say to them, this is what you do, whether it's crossing the road or dealing with angry people. It's very difficult to say to children, this is how you should do it, but look, and then do it differently ourselves. And so the sorts of things we can think about that is separating the person from some of the things that they might do. And again, I'm thinking particularly if you are a parent or somebody who works with children. So it's providing unconditional regard, that you know that you're going to like them, even if that means you don't necessarily like what they do. Helping them to focus on not just the negative, but also looking for the positive. And I mean, in a situation like we just experienced, I found it really interesting that people are saying, of course, it's been an awful situation with so many negatives. It's just awful to think about. But people have also found some positives. They've spent time with their family, possibly in a way that they might not have had the opportunity to. They've reconnected with their sense of the importance of their family, as an example. So you can find positive things, even in a highly negative situation. I think that a way that we can also support others is to encourage their efforts, and you think about not outcome, but the effort that's put into actually achieving something. People have a go, they did their best. That's actually merit. That merits a reference to. And then to think about how you model rethinking skills and coping styles, and I'll give you some examples of that in a second. And a positive outlook is something that, again, can be definitely practiced. I had a lecturer some years ago who said that there are aspects of human behaviour that really do work as a fake it till you feel it, and this is definitely one of them, as is modelling calming and focusing. I know this one isn't easy, but it's modelling just calm, dealing with the world and dealing with challenges in a calm way. So when I've talked about alternative thinking styles, this is a really old one. It comes from Beck, who's kind of known for his work, Aaron Beck known for his work on depression particularly, but actually it's really applicable to all of us. So what we know is that most of us, if we have an event that happens to us, a negative event, so for example, in this case, I've talked about you have a low grade in an exam, or you have a negative appraisal, or something that has that you feel, and the belief that might come from it is one that says, I can't do this, I can't do maths. Children will often say, I can't do maths, I'm stupid. I've worked with so many children who would say this. And of course, the consequence of that is that you feel sad, and that actually it's disempowering. And it means that next time you are less likely to try. And so what you have is this situation where every time this happens, you kind of reinforce it. So what we need to do is kind of intervene. So the same event, you need to intervene to a situation where you dispute the fact. So in a situation where, for example, you fail an exam, a really useful thing is to remind children all the other times of when they have done well, and the fact that actually, although this is not the result they necessarily wanted, it might, for example, be better than a result they did before. They can do things they haven't liked before, and that what you try to do is you replace what is a really emotional response to a situation with a rational and productive thoughts of what can we do in the future that might actually mean that you do differently. I mean, one of the things is to think about exactly that, to take a moment where you go, what would happen next time that I might be able to do differently? The really common ones, the sort of the thinking traps that I think are so common that it's for all of us, I suspect, is this kind of dichotomy of always, never. Nothing ever goes right. Bad things always happen, or everything and nothing. So these kinds of extremes of thoughts, we find ourselves, I think most of us at some stage saying this, and they're really unhelpful because they negate the grey and all the other times when this is not the case. So the jumping to conclusions is another one. So my friend didn't phone me. Working with children, it's so easy to find examples when, sort of their friend didn't get in touch. So of course that means they don't love them, without thinking of all the other possibilities that might have meant that they couldn't. So engaging in mind reading is literally where you try and you attribute other people's thoughts. You read their minds. You just make a presumption about what's going on in their heads, which you have no power to do. But it's never a positive one. It always tends to be a negative one. Fortune telling meaning where you kind of go, well, I failed this time, so therefore I will fail. That kind of aspect of it is again a really strong thinking trap. And then using emotional reasoning, and emotional reasoning is a really interesting one. So emotional reasoning is about the way that we utilize the way we feel in order to try and determine what the truth of the situation is. So you feel guilty, therefore you must be guilty. Yeah, and that is a really strong thinking trap, especially that is linked to individuals who are less resilient, I should say. So these things can just be moments where you go, stop, always, never. That's not the case. So you can challenge things as part of the ABCDE strategy that I mentioned a little while ago. The other thing that can seem that will seem really simple, but actually is really powerful, is the 3 good things. Is actually to end the day, whether you're an adult. I think you may have heard of gratitude diaries. Well, this is kind of a sort of adaptation of that, which is that you end the day really thinking about 3 things that went well. And sometimes 3 good things may just be that you got through in one piece, and that's okay too. But fundamentally, it impacts on the way that we could perceive the world in a much more positive way. And then I have this one that I really like using with young people, which is that the way that we say things to ourselves that we would never say to anybody we care about, that we would never say to a friend. So this notion of a critical versus a supportive voice. So our critical inner voice can be so debilitating and so undermining of ourselves. So it's turning that critical voice into a supportive voice by imagining, would I say this to somebody I love? And the answer is generally, you would not say it to people you love, the sorts of things that we routinely say to ourselves. This magic number, 5-1, is kind of meaningful and meaningless because actually there's countless research that makes the change, the change of the numbers. Sometimes it's 5-1, sometimes it's 6-1, sometimes it's 7-1. But it's a magic number because the finding is that if you say something super negative to somebody, it takes multiple positive statements to get you back to where you were. And that's true of other people, and it's also true of ourselves. So just to repeat, if you say something negative to a person, it takes 5, 6, 7 positive things to kind of erase the impact of that. That number actually comes from a lot of research that was done on relationships, and I've always remembered it because I think it's a really important one. And of course, the title of today is about ourselves and others, because that's everything that we say to other people, we can also say to ourselves. We need to think about resilience as being a multifaceted characteristic, a multifaceted concept that really needs to be developed in lots and lots of different small ways, and even making a small step in one direction will help. We live in a world where the sorts of things that we value are really very strange at times. I am particularly fond of this, identifying and celebrating strengths, because they are strengths that we can always find in ourselves and in others. It comes from the character strengths. It's from a positive psychology website. And if you want the slides, you'll be able to follow them. But it talks about the fact that we should value creativity and curiosity and love of learning and keeping a perspective and forgiveness and humility in a way that allows us to value more than the typical things that are described. And all of these things make up elements of our capacity to develop resilience and a positive approach, and an approach where we value ourselves in life. I'm very fond of this particular one. I work with schools where we do things like we identify one of these and we make it the strength of the week. Some schools make it the strength of the month and they go through all of them over a period of time. I worked with a school who decided that they would make a big issue of all of these, and they worked it out so that children who were with them, it was a primary school, for their primary school career, would experience these at least once. And so they made it actually not a week, they were months that they would focus on. And what it meant was that every child had the opportunity to really be successful in that moment multiple times, and to have the things they did acknowledged and valued. It was a lovely, lovely experience. Well, I always had this, and I always thought as a family that it was a really wonderful thing to have.